You're listening to Energy Insiders, a weekly update on clean energy and climate policy with Renew Economy's editor Giles Parkinson and leading energy analyst David Leach. Energy Insiders is brought to you by Evergen, providing cutting-edge energy management software for battery optimisation, virtual power plants and distributed energy resources. And Pylon, helping solar installers and retailers design high-resolution solar proposals in minutes.
Hello and welcome to this latest episode of the Energy Insiders podcast. My name is Giles Parkinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Renew Economy website and also founder and editor of the EV-focused The Driven website, which is actually sort of the EVs being the subject or petrol supplies being the subject, the large subject of today's podcast. I'm joined as usual by ITK principal David Leach, who went on a trip down to Canberra yesterday to hear about freight forwarding and the future of the freight industry. And it seems pretty clear that electric trucks are actually a thing, but not many people seem to be getting their head around it.
No, I got a little bit grumpy, particularly with Minister Catherine King, who, you know, seems to have read a report about the topic last year and could remember most of it and assumed that most of us in the room were school kids, instead of she's talking to the people, to the audience who basically, as a group know as much about electric transport as anyone in Australia. I mean, as a group, and we expect to hear some fairly useful information about someone that's taking the topic seriously, not a few welcome to country, sort of virtue signalling, and then a few platitudes, and then wander back off to do with today's issue on the fuel crisis, about which nothing can be done, as our guest today suggested.
Yes, we'll get on to our guest soon, but yes, I mean, you seem to be particularly perturbed by her assertion that the electric truck technology wasn't here, but there it was actually parked right outside, having just completed a trip from Sydney.
Now, I've got a disclosure to make, Giles, for the benefit of disclosures and honesty. I have actually invested in New Energy Transport, a small amount of my superannuation money. So I just want to be clear, I am talking my book when we get to it now.
Okie dokie. Well, I did actually interview Daniel Bleakley earlier this week, as you had him on the podcast, or we had him on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. You interviewed him then, and they actually just delivered their first electric truck delivery. A whole bunch of bog paper, as it turns out, but still 27 tons. Raced up the hills, overtook a bunch of trucks, got from Sydney to Canberra 25 minutes earlier, put in a whole bunch of sort of last mile electric vans, and did the whole job for an 85% reduction in fuel costs. Now, of course, there is the slight issue about when you buy these things, it's probably twice as much as... No, he says. No.
I was able to talk to one of the to my channel sources, and I found out that basically the Windrose truck is about $475,000 on the road. And if you go and look what one of these big Kenworths costs, you will find it's about $450,000.
Well, there you go. Well, it looks like it's not just a total cost of ownership thing. It's actually cost parity. And
it's the absolutely overwhelming problem mentioned by just about everyone who actually spoke at the thing. The first thing everyone said at there was it's energy security. Well, that's really news to me. I hadn't worked that out, I mean, and by the way, everyone would have said the same at the conference last year and the conference before that. I mean, it's not news that we have a security issue around oil dependence. What is unfortunately true is that it's just been completely ignored. But and where is the evidence of that ignorance? It's that there's absolutely no charging infrastructure for trucks. When I say absolutely none, you could count on the fingers of one hand the charging depots in Australia. Now, how many service stations are there, Giles?
I don't know.
No, but it's thousands, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, on an EV per car, EV charging points per car in Australia, I think I can't remember the number, it's 80 or 120, but whatever it is so far higher than most other countries in the world, which is down around about sort of in the teens and the 20s and 30s and things like that. And then for trucks, there's nothing. Although I should point out that ARENA did provide announced funding this week for New Volt to put in three all around Melbourne, so they can just go around the Melbourne Loop a bit. But look, it's a start, David. It's a start. Let's be positive.
No, I agree. It's a start, and Zenobi did one last year, and people will remember we interviewed Zenobi last year.
Yes. And they've just announced this week another $100 million, which they want to invest into sort of trucking fleets and things like that. So there's movement, well, there's talk and there's movement and there's investment in things, but it doesn't quite get us out of our pickle. We could have done this a bit earlier.
We could go, well, it's very piecemeal, very not half, by the people involved, it's absolutely full on. But from a national perspective, it's very half-hearted. It's not like the home battery program, if I can put it that way, where I think we got up to, 300,000 this week or something like that.
Yeah, over 300,000. And look, EV sales have obviously taken off. I think Origin Energy came out today and said that their EV subscription offerings have been exhausted. I think AGL have got a similar tale to tell. All the anecdotal evidence is that things are racing out the door, and it's going to
be my channel evidence is that one of the charging networks said they'd had their best month ever in terms of utilisation and volume charged.
And on top of that, as petrol and diesel prices go up, we've been noticing that the price of Tesla superchargers, at least around this region, has actually been going down. So once it was usually pretty consistently in the 60s to 70 cents range, and now it's down in the low 50s or even the mid 40s. So it's a blissful irony.
It's encouraging news on the car front, but 55% of our oil consumption is in the form of diesel. And it's not, as John says, and as you quickly realise, it's not about driver inconvenience. It's about the fact that the distribution of our goods and services in this country is entirely dependent, almost, on diesel roads. I mean, we ship some bulks around in the trains, like iron ore, wheat and coal. But here's another shocker, this bloody GST on coal. Right? Do you know how much, not the GST, the diesel fuel rebate? The federal government hands $1.7 billion to coal companies to move, to drive diesel trucks round. And the diesel trucks have been driven round, as IEFA pointed out, because the drag lines can't get to the coal anymore because it's in the wrong places. It's getting more expensive to mine. So they drop the drag lines and move to diesel trucks. The diesel truck uses 7 times as much energy as the drag line. 7 times. So there, we've got this electrify everything kind of idea. Well, the coal industry's got the unelectrify everything idea. And so the federal government happily accedes to that by handing the industry $1.7 billion, which is then returned to the Queensland and New South Wales government in the form of royalties. The whole thing is completely Australian.
Well, it might be a little bit global, actually, but I mean, it could be uniquely Australian. Look, you did mention John, and I think you're referring to John Blackburn, who's the former Deputy Chief of the Air Force in Australia, former pilot, and is currently head of the Institute of Integrated Energy Economics in Australia. And he's been quite outspoken about Australia's fuel security issues, and we caught up with him earlier today. So let's have a listen to our conversation with John Blackburn. John Blackburn, thank you for joining the Energy Insiders podcast.
Most welcome. Great to have a talk.
Look, we actually had you on the Driven podcast back in 2019. You were talking about energy security then. You were talking about energy resilience. We now find ourselves in another crisis. Have we not learned anything?
No. From both sides of politics, ignoring absolutely clear evidence that we had a problem. And the reason it hasn't been addressed adequately is it's not an election issue. So on the side of the Liberal side, yes, we had over a few years, Andrew Hastie initially paid attention and triggered the Liquid Fuel Security Review in 2018. And then by 2020, with Angus Taylor as the Energy Minister, he used to ring me at home. And we'd yell at each other until we figured out that, hang on, we were both trying to say the same thing. But even Angus Taylor had limitations posed on him because the Liberal Party just basically was saying it's not an election issue, we won't push it. Jim Molan faced the same problem. As a senator, he was trying to get the national security strategy going, and we worked with Jim behind the scenes. Well, not an election issue. Not that much difference on the Labor side. Well, it is now.
Well, we do find ourselves in the final pickle. Just how bad a pickle are we in?
Fundamentally failed to prepare. And so what we've got ourselves in a situation is we can only react. And particularly with this government who hasn't faced a crisis before, they were in opposition for so long. And they're almost taking what's described in the press as a managerial approach, which is pretty correct. Very slow to respond, hands off to a certain degree. And then coming to realize what the state was, they started to act slowly until I think it was yesterday, when the Prime Minister announced, right, we now have this national fuel response plan and everything else. So we're still not getting ahead of the game. And when the Prime Minister said we're going to over-prepare, it really convinced me he doesn't know what he's talking about. When you're not prepared and you're reacting, you need to get ahead of the game, but we will never be over-prepared. We are now stuck in a reactive mode because it's not just fuel.
To be fair, in terms of preparation, I don't think anyone could be adequately prepared to your standards, John, based on what I heard at the conference yesterday when you've got cyclone bloody shutters on your windows in Canberra. But nevertheless, leaving that aside, I'm not very good at economics, but and you're at an economics institute. So can you explain this to me? If you cut the price of something by, say, reducing the subsidy, will that increase or reduce demand?
Well, this is why the reluctance from the Prime Minister to do so. He's been talking about this for the last week or so, and the opposition have been pushing it. So two factors. The concern there is if you reduce price, you're going to get an increase in demand. And that's a real concern. I think the other one is Alba didn't want to do something that the opposition was pushing for. Okay, but let's come back to it. We know the economic pressure on our citizens, on the trucking industry, on farmers is immense. So there's two options. You could say, well, we're not going to reduce the price, in other words, to try and keep the demand down. Or you could do what the National Liquid Fuel Emergency Response Plan actually said. This is the document from 2019, 82 pages. It was already in existence. And how you can control demand is you introduce control measures. Now, this was a confidential document until Rex Patrick FOI'd it to death, and now it's out. If you see what the government's doing in their very nice, simple five or 6 page plan, it's actually an extract from here. But what he won't say is what's on page 20 of that plan is what you do to control demand. So I agree. The smart thing is reduce those prices to take that pressure off. But you, as a government, then need to work very closely with states and territories to say, if we see that demand level going up or certainly not dropping, then we're going to have to introduce control measures, which the Liquid Fuel Emergency Act has provisions for if you get around to implementing it.
So basically, that's fuel rationing in a sentence, one way or another. And I'll come back to it. But the second point is, so my view is that when you cut price, you tend to increase demand. You don't reduce it. Now the second point is, slightly more subtle, but not so much so. If there's only a fixed quantity of something to go around, and you cut the tax on it, what tends to happen is that the prices just go back up again, and the tax is just transferred from the government revenue to the oil producers. Or have I got that wrong too?
Well, the prices are going to go up anyway. When you try and take 100% demand across the world and squeeze that into an 80% supply, because again, this is the politicians were so slow. 80% of the world's oil supply is unaffected. 20% is, okay? We're not going to run out of fuel. But what will happen, and is in the process happening now, is the 100% demand now switches to an 80% supply. So prices will go up, and there'll be a bit of a reorganization of the whole oil and fuel trading system. The transport is going to be quite messy. And that's separate from whatever the hell happens in the next month or whatever in the Middle East. But even if that Straits of Hormuz were open tomorrow, you've got this 20% hole moving through the whole world supply system. And it'll take weeks, if not months, for the actual distribution systems to settle down. But there's a lot of residual damage that's been done that will take, possibly in some cases, years to fix. So we are going to face price increases. But with the degree of excise in there and the GSTs and everything else, that what they've done actually makes a lot of sense, because we're going to have to control demand. We won't have any choice. The supply that's there right now hasn't changed from what it was before the conflict. But that shortage we'll start to see in the supply side probably in about 2 weeks because of the delays it takes to get through the system that was already working. Now, when it gets here, if you have 30 days of supply of diesel, which we don't, but let's just pretend we do. If you have 30 days of supply and say half of the supply stopped, when they have 30 days would last 2 months. If you have a 20% cut, simplistically, which is what you'd expect, well, then that 30 days would last 150. Well,
So we have to cut demand by 20%, but we've actually encouraged demand to grow by cutting price. So how do we, in fact, I mean, the fact is the government should be preparing us quite strongly for fuel rationing.
Yeah. Now, remembering that regardless of everything else, demand has grown somewhere between 50 and 100%. So initially I thought it was 150% of normal flow. Yesterday, the Prime Minister said, yes, 100% increase. That's because people see the madness in the Middle East, don't have confidence in what the government's saying, so they all go out and start stockpiling themselves. That's what's caused the problem in our system today.
So can I just be clear? Demand is not increasing, or at least consumption is not increasing. What is increasing is storage held in the private sector.
Yes. And the sooner you're going to run out of space to put all this stuff, and then you'll see houses start to catch fire because people will be storing fuel in strange places. I mean, that's what's happened overseas. So whilst it's hard to accept, what Albanese and Barnum have been saying is correct. There is no change to the available amount of fuel in our system, but that pipeline, or the supply chain, if you like, is very fragile. We've ignored all the symptoms. It's like you've got an artery that's starting to get constricted. The cardiologist says, oh, you're going to have a problem. You might be for a heart attack. And so we've ignored all those heart attack symptoms, and now we're having a heart attack. What's happened if we cause it to ourselves? The compounding problem is the only thing the government could do, and they've right to do it, is they've taken some of those stock holdings, so the reserves, and they've released them to try and plug the holes that people are feeling, particularly out in the country and rural areas. But they're putting that extra fuel into that pipeline that's already highly stressed, which is why it takes a long time for that additional fuel they're releasing to get to the people that need it. Next thing we're going to have to deal with is whatever.
Can I just say, I've got a daughter that lives on the Sunshine Coast in an urban area, and she told me that all the service stations she drove past today on the Sunshine Coast are out of diesel. So I think actually, at least in the short term, there's going to be a lot of angst about it. And I personally believe strongly that in the very end, populations want governments to be strong about stuff in a lot of ways. They like discipline. And if they were told that they had to drive less for the benefit of everyone, in my personal opinion, they would respond to that appropriately.
I fully agree. What we need at this time is leadership. Leadership because we are not at peacetime. We're not at peacetime. Change the mindset. And what you've got to say is be honest with people. And during COVID, I sent recordings of what the Singaporean Prime Minister said to their own population, to Jim Mullen, said, can you give these to Scott Morrison and learn about communicating? And what the Singaporeans do is they go, here is what we know. We are going to do this for this reason. Here are some unknowns, and as we work it out, we'll do it. But what we need is all of us to work together, and we need you, the population, to do it. A little bit easier, I guess, with the Singaporean culture. But in our case, we're not doing it. Oh, well, if you feel like working from home, well, you might want to just drive a little less. I mean, for heaven's sake, there's a tsunami coming at us. We're going to manage it, so we're not going to drown. But let's not all sit on the edge of the beach and go, well, this will be interesting. I'm going to keep doing what I do until the tsunami hits me. That's stupidity. There is not a leadership culture in our political system. Would you follow those people into wars? No. And so this is why we're struggling. It's a managerial approach. Well, we'll leave it to the states. And in Victoria and New South Wales, no, you won't. You need to take a national approach, which is correct. And so at least yesterday we started that. But look, we are slow to react, and we don't have a political system that actually understands what's happening. So in question time, we're seeing a dismal display of teenage boys playing games with each other and smirking. And meanwhile, we've got a serious issue that we have to manage, and you don't do that by fighting each other in the Parliament House. It's juvenile behaviour. And then when the announcement comes yesterday, I was on ABC News straight after the Prime Minister. Listen to the last thing he said. Well, this is the fault of what the Liberals did in the last 10 years. They were putting stocks in Texas. It's rubbish. The stocks in Texas were nothing to do with our stock holdings for our use. They were a part of trying to meet the IEA obligation, And so Angus Taylor bought those to try and say to the IEA, we're going to try and grow our stocks for the IEA obligation. But you've got a prime minister in the middle of a crisis trying to point score against the opposition, and then you've got the opposition playing the same way. This is not acceptable. We need to face reality and stop playing games.
We seem to be inevitably heading towards some sort of rationing then at some point in time, particularly if this is, drags on over another 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 2 months, and that seems inevitable. What also seems inevitable is that these sort of issues may return. We just live in such an uncertain world with the Trump administration, everything like that. So what should we be doing then on the medium term to the long term? What sort of action should we be taking into place? Should we be accelerating electrification? Should we be rolling out infrastructure for charging? Other solutions?
Before I answer that, perhaps if I read the extract out of the confidential plan, what's going to happen next? So if we don't keep being stupid and storing stuff everywhere and take it back to a normal demand level, then probably in about 2 weeks, we'll start to see the symptoms of the supply chain having holes in it. But as I said, if it was 20% and we had the 30 days, which is actually a little less, then you could last a couple of months, 4 or 5 months, by using those stocks to plug in the holes of the shortfall. You will get to a point around about when you've only got 10 days of stocks left, when they have hinted that they will do things. There's managerial language like we'll restrict sales and prioritize users. Well, Australians know what that is. Let me just read from the actual plan, which they are actually following, but it's much more. Government preference to allow industry to respond to the emergency in first instance, and et cetera, said, look, mandatory controls will only be introduced if the market-based measures don't achieve the desired outcomes. But if that's the case, people may be restricted in their fuel consumption for certain periods of time, and the prioritization of available resources to critical users will be affected. That's rationing.
So, yeah, it is. And so who's a critical user? Like when I've just been analysing for weeks now diesel consumption, and, the biggest user is probably the mining industry. And they've got their own. They can probably slow down in some extent. Share a little bit of pain around.
Well, critical users, in my view, is you've got emergency services and things like that, which are pretty obviously hospitals, all that sort of stuff. The next thing is our whole logistics system is diesel. We better make sure that we've got that running, otherwise that just stops functioning.
Food delivery,
those examples. Now, the mines, I think they will bring their own fuel in anyway. It's not coming out of It's not coming out of Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane. So, from what I can see, they're pulling a lot of that stuff in sea. So, for the available the resources in the north supply chain, you'll start to prioritize those. As it is right now, defense is not on operations. You wouldn't prioritize that over the logistics system in the country. So, there's a series of steps. But again, this is nothing to be scared about. 80% of the supply is still there. If we work as a team and stop selling silly buggers and just buying stuff for ourselves, because we're actually hurting our neighbors. The people who are suffering right now is the result of their neighbors going out and getting stocks just in case, people for the jerry cans. Back to your other question, what do you do? So we put a 5-part paper out last week. We said, look, we're in a panicky mode. We're reacting. We're not going to be over-prepared, and we'll continue to do it. What should we do beyond that? Oh, by the way, it's not just fuels. Well, we put a paper out with 5 options. What could you do to increase your substitute your supply instead of imports, your supply? The only thing we could do quickly in a matter of months is actually implement the ethanol mandates in New South Wales and Queensland. We export 60% of all our ethanol production at the moment in Australia to overseas countries who put it into their fuel supply. Like the US is now like E15, Brazil has a lot. So what happens, we're exporting it in some cases at a bit of a loss. But if you actually put it in at the mandated level, say E10, you would, over a period of, say, 6 to 12 months, increase your petrol supply by about 2.5%. So that's in the paper we wrote. There are considerations going around now in government of changing standards and things to allow for increased use of ethanol. That's the only thing you can do in a hurry. Other things you need to think about doing. Could we use some of that light sweet crude that's currently heading off overseas off the Northwest Shelf? You could have mixed some of that into the last 2 refineries, but you can't use it at the scale you would like to because those refineries aren't designed for it, and there's not enough time to actually make a change. Could you introduce over time gas to liquids or condensate through to fuels? Yes, you'd have to have small-scale refineries probably in the north, to do it, then that you're now talking a couple of years to do these things. So there are 5 options, certainly renewable, diesel, low carbon, liquid fuels, accelerate as fast as you can. But that's not going to happen in the short term. Step beyond that. What else should you be doing now? Well, we should have done what we did years ago. How do we transform our liquid fuel system? And the number one is reduce demand. Number thing there is electrification. It's bleeding obvious. We've known that for a long time. But when you had a previous Prime Minister...
That's what irritates me. Sorry. It just irritates me because I was just reading a paper from the Energy Futures Foundation. I myself wrote papers last year, and everyone's been writing papers for years, but it's like confetti. Like you said, the politicians just don't give a rat's about actually doing it.
So why? So remember Morrison, and Michaela Cash. Oh, this will ruin your weekend and all this sort of rubbish. Now,
thanks for the memories.
Oh, gosh. So when I look at all the work I started doing with a lot of others back in 2014, the main adversary we had then was the Australian Superpetroleum. It went to the 2015 Senate inquiry into fuel security, said mandated stocks aren't necessary. The industry can do this fine. It's a waste of money. Now, if we'd followed that line, then we could be as low as 12 or 13 days of diesel as we were in 2013 and 14, instead of the 30 the government's saying. Good idea we didn't follow it. So we've seen similar things from lobby groups that counter this. It's not in the fossil fuels interest, business-wise, to have mass-scale electrification. And so we've seen that pressure over time, don't subsidize it. This is part of our problem. And so that is necessary, but it can't just be electric cars, of course. It needs to be the transport network. And, having ridden in the Volvo electric truck yesterday and seen all the other ones there, this is possible. But we're going to be putting that load onto a growing electricity system in Australia. Here's a couple of challenges. Let's slowly. The last time we did a national energy security assessment was 2011. After a lot of pressure behind the scenes, the Liberals did say they'd do one in 2015, 16, 17. I gave up in 18, and I don't know if the Labor Party knows what one is. So without a national energy security assessment, of course, there's no national security strategy and there's no national risk assessment, we're going to be loading up the electricity system. And projections from AEMO is 180, sort of 150%, 180% growth, to 300% growth. When I look at the AEMO Integrated System Plan, and I've been paying a lot of attention to that in recent years because I spent the last few years consulting to the offshore wind sector through to Ecuador. And you look at this and you suddenly realize there's no design in this. When I looked at the offshore wind pieces, there was a small part in the ISP, which was the Victorian state government's targets. There was nothing else.
I don't know what you mean by design because, like you, I spent, weeks and weeks of my life in that ISP and that data and months. And I'm not sure that I agree that there's no design in it. What I would say is they have no authority or implementation ability other than approving transmission lines a bit. So that's an issue. But as far as a plan goes, the word plan implies a design, and I think there is a design in there.
So I spent 2020 looking at our energy resilience, and I had 6 power system engineers. These are very highly qualified and experienced power system engineers from Engineers Australia. They said to me, there's not that many power system engineers in AEMO, they're market operators as a principle. And these power system engineers said it's not properly designed. Why would I say that? What is the appropriate balance between offshore wind, onshore wind, and solar in this renewable system? Look at the ISP and tell me if there's any thinking about that. The next thing is,
hang on. You don't understand the ISP when you say that. The ISP is designed against a suite of policies. It essentially has to conform with all the policy goals that are set by individual states. And as far as the modelling goes of what the balance between offshore wind, which I don't think is economic at the moment, and I've said so publicly, and
of the matter true.
There's actually quite a lot of work that goes into that, and I could point you to endless studies. But let's not get bogged down on that point, because I'd like to come on to security. I'd really like to understand what you think as a security person about the Straits of Hormuz, and whether we're going to be permanent, whether Iran's going to be essentially taxing it from now into eternity, and so that's going to essentially move the oil price up globally forever.
Right, so let's just step back to the ISP again for a second. I take the words of these very experienced power system engineers, and I believe what they're telling me. So when I looked at the trade-offs, I couldn't find any federal or New South Wales state plan, for example, what they thought they would want to aim for in terms of those balances within the state. That was one part of it. It wasn't also helped because the politics, Peter Dutton said offshore wind farms kill baby whales, and then
let's forget about the political arguments. I mean, the Victorian government has a target for renewable energy and for offshore wind.
Yes.
That's embodied in the ISP.
Okay. And the other point in there is, of course, we have to look at the electrification of industry with some of the green exports barriers. So there's those scenarios, and Saul Griffiths was talking 600%. Now we've got this issue about data centers. I spent a lot of time with AI in the last few years into the industry. The idea that, okay, look at the load increase the data centers have done for the electricity system in the US, and having talked to government officials looking at data center policy, when I spoke to them last year, they hadn't comprehended what the impact of data centers were on the US electrical system. And when I asked them, did they understand what the stresses would be on our electrical system of the already options that were out there, the answer was no. So I'm very concerned that we may not go into an intelligent plan for the introduction of data centers.
Well, again, just to be clear, the ISP has a scenario with data centers explicitly modelled in the demand side of things. It's one of the options that you can put in there. Also, and this is just me, it's not clear to me how much actual data centre in the sense of large language model growth there really will be in Australia. I think myself. Anyway, let's look. I'd like to talk about defence, because defence is what I think I particularly like to hear about from you. But I might be getting in the way, Giles.
I'd like to make the big leap from the ISP to the Straits of Hormuz, because I'd just be very interested in your assessment, John, of what the situation is going to be there in the long term. And just from a sort of a military point of view, I mean, just looking at what the heck's going on there, because a lot of people are scratching their heads. A lot of retired generals and admirals in the US and Europe are just going, well, basically, what the fuck? So what's your assessment?
I'll talk from a national security perspective. Yes, I had 43 years in defense. My focus is on national security, which is a darn sight more than defense, because defense is a very narrow view, and defense doesn't understand business, and it doesn't understand, it's almost an isolated community in some ways, being honest about it. So, Middle East scenarios, that was included in a lot of war games we did in defense. It was included in the studies I did within RMA. We always looked at that as one of the choke points, and the problem would be quite severe. But there was one scenario, and I said this on television the other day, there's one scenario we never thought of, it just never occurred to us, is that conflict would be caused by a rogue US president who has cognitive decline problems, one of the most powerful militaries in the world, and is running around bombing whatever he can find in countries around the world and frankly committing war crimes. That never occurred to us. And so, yes, we've done the scenarios. I mean, just go and look at my NRMA papers, they're in there. But we never actually contemplated that our great and powerful ally would go rogue. It's not just me saying that. Read The Atlantic. The article's in there at the moment.
It's an extraordinary situation then to sort of find ourselves in terms of how we get out of this. I mean, we really have no choice but to sort of implement, I think, because we may have this rogue president for another 3 years, surely we need to accelerate those medium and long-term issues.
Let's talk about the immediate problem right now. So, look, you'll lose interest within a month or two and go off and, bomb Cuba or something. There's two problems here. Even if you open the strait again, right, from what I've been reading from the logistics people and that sort of stuff, it will take weeks, if not, into the month, for the supply chain process to reinitialize. But you've got all the damage that's occurred in there. I mean, Qatar, you're taking out, 10% or something of their gas. That's going to take 3 to 5 years to rebuild. If it goes and blows up Cargo Island, then you're going to have a whole bunch of other problems. So you're going to have a legacy damage problem, and the time for the supply chain to start working. By the time that flows through, then we'll have to have been some really interesting readjustment of the global market to try and access that 80% that does exist. And that's going to be quite confusing. And what I was saying, I think we should assume that could go on for a few more months. They'll run out of weapons pretty soon anyway. And then we're going to deal with two problems, that whole market confusion. Let's say that we end up with a 15% less supply. That could go on for quite a bit of time whilst it sorts itself out, months, a year. So you've got an economic impact and you've got an energy system impact. That turbulence will be there for a while. We have to readjust. We're not going to run out of fuel, but we won't get as much. That's a difficult thing for us to deal with. Yes, we should be getting on as we should have got a long time ago. How fast can we do the electrification? As I said, I have personally, from the system engineers, serious concerns about what the risks are in that transition. And then in addition to that, we're going to have to look at supply substitution. And that's where things like, renewable diesel, biofuels, ethanol, can we do something with condensate and things like that? That's expensive. It's going to take time. Reduce demand, substitute some of the other liquid fuel sources, so it reduces our import dependencies. This is a very complex transition. And when I look at my experience with the department, 2015, I was told we didn't need any refineries because it was cheaper to import refined fuel. That was an SES officer in the department. There was a mentality in there. I wasn't sure they were grasping the problem.
Yeah, I don't quite get that. I understand that diesel doesn't actually keep as long as oil. But beyond that, what difference does it make whether you store oil or run the economic cost every year of having uneconomic refineries that have to run at a loss? I mean, what's the difference?
Well, we have to reduce our import dependencies of our energy. So stocks alone are not a solution. Stocks are a spring in the supply chain. What we have to look at is, how do we have even a base amount? We used to have 40% of all our transport fuels came from Australian oil through Australian refineries. It was down to less than 10% by 2013. So we also have a greater diversity of oil sources, and that's where refineries gave us some flexibility, but we went from 7 refineries down to 2, and we've only extended their contract to 2030. What do we do after that? If you don't have refineries, then we lose that ability to process any oil ourselves, but we've got to think about what is that scale, the amount of sovereign energy control we have in addition to stocks, whilst we go through this transition to electrify. It's a very complex.
Yeah, I get that. But if we had refineries instead of importing oil, you're telling me that the advantage is we could maybe use some more of our own oil, which is actually not necessarily oil anyway. A lot of it is condensate and stuff these days, and it's declining every year. And we could import different oil from different sources, assuming our refineries are actually set up to process it. I don't actually see, whereas now we have a diversified supply portfolio. When I was looking at this the other day, we were getting about 35% from Singapore, and Singapore has its own problems because it does depend heavily on Hormuz oil. And we're getting about 25 or 30%, I think, from South Korea. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And they've got a big reserve and they can keep producing as much as they want to, but they're already restricting exports to, last year's levels. But it seems to me we can import from the USA. I can't actually see what the disadvantage is by importing the finished product as opposed to the raw oil.
Because we export, if you look at crude, distillate, and LNG, the equivalent to 30% of our total liquid fuel consumptions. The problem we face is that we cannot be so import dependent. 90% of our medicines, for example. We need a percentage of that supply that we can guarantee that when combined with stocks gives us a greater surety of resilience.
But what can you do with the exported LNG? There's 75 million tonnes that we export, but I don't see how that's at all relevant to an oil shortage. I mean, you can't convert LNG to...
But you can convert condensate.
Yeah, but that's not LNG. Most of what we export is LNG.
Yeah, but the point of the LNG is what the government's doing now. We are an exporter of fossil fuels, and then we can have the agreements and bilateral deals with countries to then get a supply back. That was the point of the agreement last week about Singapore.
I agree with that 100%, and I think that's a good weapon, but I don't think it helps your argument that having more refineries in Australia would be of any advantage to importing oil.
I didn't say more of the same refineries we've got now, is if we could do things like condensate processing in the small scale one. But the other thing is renewable diesel, SAF, biofuels. We need to see what we could do to produce in Australia to have an increased percentage of the liquid fuels under our control. When we've only got less than 10%, we leave ourselves completely open to scenarios like we're seeing now. And that's why we're in this thing. Hey, the shipping lanes, we have no flagged ships that can move fuel or oil. Everything happens in foreign flagged ships. So our control over this is minimal. That's why we're in a panic.
Well, it's an interesting conundrum. I'm not too sure we're going to have it completely solved right now. But look, John, thank you very much for your input. We do have, we're probably sort of running out of time. I just hope that we actually just sort of take the opportunity to electrify as quickly as we can, because it just seems to me to be the obvious solution.
Oh, it is, but you'll find other interest groups will start fighting against it. What I did,
Oh my word!
what I said at the
That's a surprise. I need a Valium now.
what I said at this is what I said at the conference. I speak to a lot of industry groups of all different types. I've seen in the last few years, I've watched the electrification crowd and the bioenergy crowd fight each other, and then green hydrogen pops up and everyone kicks that in the head. I've got to tell you what, if I was in the fossil fuel industry, I'd be running my hands together, because the renewable energy and the electric energy crew are all fighting each other, or some of them are fighting each other. What I said to them is, the end solution for this in our lifetimes is a mix of a whole different types of energies with a greater degree of resilience. Stop fighting each other and team up. Support each other in the arguments. Because I seriously have read reports, bioenergy can do all of this, or electrification can do all that. Stop the fights. Work together as a team, because it's a very complex transition. And unfortunately, a lot of the industry groups I dealt with are very narrow in their focus, because they're looking at their part of the puzzle. We've got to look as a collective way.
I think that's a fair observation too, and a nice way to end this conversation. Look, John Blackburn, thank you very much for joining the Energy Insiders podcast. It's been really fascinating to look into something that we haven't looked at much, but I think everyone's going to be very focused on it over the next couple of months. So thank you very much, John.
You're welcome. We need to wish ourselves a lot of luck, because I tell you, we're going to need it.
Yes. We have. I agree. I think your first point, that we didn't prepare and therefore we can only react, that is such a strong point.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
G'day, Alex Carey here. The GoodWe ESA all-in-one home storage solution is here, and it's a game changer. It's packed with market-leading features, full home backup and 6-level battery protection. With up to 48 kilowatt hours in a single stack, the ESA is a breeze to install with no gateway needed. The GoodWe ESA series is available now and priced to cover the 2026 drop in the rebate. Visit goodwe.com.au for more information.
And that was John Blackburn. Well, David, look, apart from the conversation about ISP and email, I actually thought it was just a really interesting perspective, and just really just sort of highlighting a couple of things. One, just a complete clusterfuck that's happening up in the Middle East at the moment, in the Strait of Hormuz, international politics and things like that.
That's excuse me, word, Giles.
Excuse me for swearing, but I
think
I think we can.
Apologies to all the young listeners on the audience.
And yes, to both of them. And now you completely derailed my thought. And just sort of Australia's just lack of preparation, the fact that we haven't done anything, and look, sort of highlighted, I think, probably what you said at the start of this conversation about Catherine King, and just not being aware of what is possible pushing forward. So hopefully now we can actually use this as a way to sort of push forward. I mean, halving fuel excise duty is just sort of like, pissing in the wind, really counterproductive.
We hand that diesel fuel excise out so that the coal industry can move, wait for it, 6 billion tonnes of overburden, so that we can get 400 million tonnes of coal out, exported overseas, in the process using a whole lot more energy. Do you know that shipping, 30 to 40% of shipping, is moving coal, oil and gas around the world? Of the total tonnes of stuff shipped all around the world, well, it's a bit less now thanks to the Straits of Hormuz, but generally most of the time, 30 to 40% of it is just shipping carbon for someone else to release in the air. And we're expending all this stuff, moving the overburden, like 6 billion tonnes a year. I don't know about you, but that's more than fits in my backyard. It's a lot, and it's all just a complete waste. It's just another example of how Australia is wasting its productivity opportunity by not going hard enough or thinking hard enough. I think we've already shown with things like the home battery, with rooftop solar, and now it's going to be with electric cars, that if you set up and get determined, like to some extent Chris Bowen has done, we won't talk too much about the CIS, but a lot of these other consumer-related things, and you give people a chance and an opportunity and a signal, and work out that as Australia, you want to be in the forefront and a leader in these things, and that the prize is worth the effort, then we can get a lot done. And if you sit around and just dilly-dally, and wait for someone else to come along and make some decisions for you, we're going to go backwards.
No, exactly right. And we have an opportunity now to move forward. So let's hope we do. David, you were at that conference all day. And anything else that sort of, leap out at you as interesting technologies or interesting thoughts?
The thing that I gave my sort of prize for the best presentation that I'd like to do. I mean, it's a highly sought after honour, the David Leitch Prize for Best Presentation.
Look, almost as sought after as the FIFA Peace Prize.
Yeah, absolutely. To Thingamajig, who gave who gave a presentation on the health effects of diesel, and pointed out with a lot of facts and evidence, which were otherwise in pretty short supply at this conference. There's a lot of chest beating and ideology, which I agree with, but I'm interested in hard facts and numbers. About the health consequences cost you about $6 billion a year in Australia. And that if you've got a preschool kid who lives who goes to kindergarten on a busy road and eats diesel, you should be worried.
Yeah. These are things which have actually come out in the past, but very rarely get any sort of airing in mainstream media. I'm going to sort of keep on prattling on for a bit while you find out who Thingamajig is.
How did you know I was doing that? Claire Walter, Dr. Claire Walter.
Oh,
it was
good.
a very good presentation.
Excellent.
Excuse me for not remembering names. I'm getting old.
Well, aren't we all? Yeah. Anyway, but yeah, look, it's just one of the things that we forget. Just the health impact of tailpipe emissions, diesel, petrol.
So we're going backwards, Giles. We've relaxed the sulphur content of diesel kind of restrictions just now. I mean, sulphur's not very good for your health either. Sulphur oxide and nitrous oxide are major causes of smog and fine particulate emissions that get stuck in your lungs. So, we actually had a program, quite a good program for having high quality diesel and petrol, but it's all gone out the window. Anyway, we can wring our hands, but the point is it's really time to have a good, strong national plan. But I'm interrupting you again.
No, look, that's okay. No, I was just going to sort of go back to what I'm thinking and look, it's a bit sort of predictions, but look, I'm suspecting that the EV share data for the month of March could be well into the 20s and even the high 20s. If you think about, I had to have a laugh the other day, sort of Matt Canavan sort of saying that he liked Teslas but didn't want to buy them because of potential resale value. And if you look at some of the second-hand prices of fossil fuel cars,
sure that we'd want to buy his Tesla anyway, because it's got a negative Canavan value.
What's called it's coal dust all on the top of it from his makeup. Right. So yes. Anyway, where was I going?
So just on that, I have another family member that was looking at taking advantage of the lease rebate and novated lease, and she wanted to buy the BYD sales room on Saturday afternoon and couldn't find anyone to talk to her. She was walking around with dollars in her hand, and no one was at all interested. They were all too busy signing deals on the spot. So that is going to happen. Now, some listeners, not very many probably, are going to wonder why we're not talking about what's going on in the national electricity market. And the reason for that is nothing is going on. Electricity prices are low, gas prices are low. As we've already noted, it's actually been a reasonable amount of wind recently. Prices were minus $200 in South Australia briefly this afternoon for reasons I haven't got round to discovering. But the real thing is that there are no new wind farms being built other than one or two in South Australia. And certainly there aren't any new wind farms being built in New South Wales other than Ungula,
which has had 48 concrete pours now and 21 to go.
Yes, and that's only taken about 3 years to get that far.
On the flip side, David, is that Hills of Gold, that wind farm up near Nundle, has finally got the all clear to go ahead now. The local regional council took a
Tamworth Council.
Tamworth Regional Council, and just like a basket case of a court case, and the judge pretty much said so. So eventually they sort of dropped it after spending God knows how much on legal fees and stuff like that, sort of arguing over sort of road signs and a couple of trees on verges and things like that. It was quite ridiculous in the end. But look, look, it's been a really hard road for them, and congratulations to some of the renewables who are still in there. They bought
it about 18 months ago, didn't you?
Yeah, that's right. Well, they bought it off on G, who just basically had enough. So look, best of luck to them. I mean, some of them are also involved in that wind project, the Pottinger Wind Project. Yeah, down with AGL in the southwest of New South Wales. AGL, I should just point out just one bit of news: reached financial close on a gas-fired power station over in Perth. 220 megawatts. The interesting thing about that is it gets so much capacity credits, it pretty much gets its capex back in over 6 years without having to switch the damn thing on. But I guess that's one way of supporting firm power.
And the battery, AEMO actually does a pretty good job with its data. I don't think it's appreciated how well they supply data to the market, so we can all build our squizzy little dashboards and I've been looking. They actually publish a number every 5 minutes, I think it is, of the battery state of charge. You can look at individual batteries or across regions. And the good news, Giles, is that I keep getting an SMS from my fancy little squizzy data dashboard saying that the new record for the total amount of energy stored, which is now up to, I think, around 12 gigawatt hours I saw the other day. And lots more to come yet.
Yes. And I just point out that I think batteries took a 33% share of the evening peak in South Australia the other day, which I think might be a record. And I just note also 41% in the California grid in the evening peak a couple of days ago, which is really quite significant when you think about it and its implication on gas generation. And I guess that was borne out in the gas statement of opportunities that came out from AEMO last week, which said that batteries and electrification is reducing the need for gas. So who knew?
Yes. Anyone would think they'd been listening to what we were saying for years.
Well, I think they have been, so that's good. But they're not data. They want data, David. That's fair enough. They want data, just not us.
No, I agree with that.
On.
And it's great to have that forecast. But of course, it might be revised up again next year. Forecast been the nature of forecast. But the other thing I do think we do need to work out overall is how to keep an eye on the total amount. What's actually happening with these home batteries? Like how they're being used. Yes, we know 300,000 have been installed and we can probably work out the gigawatt hours of capacity, but what we need to understand is how they're actually being used.
We're almost none of them as VPPs.
Yeah. But it doesn't show up in the consumption data per se. It doesn't show up in the output data. It's all behind the meter.
But we're not seeing, despite all the LOR 1s and the LOR 2s that we've had warnings going through and sort of potential supply sort of constraints, we're not seeing those big spike in prices nearly as much as we had this time last year. So I think that's possibly a sign, but it would be nice to have some more data on that. David, before we wrap up, I just want to mention South Australia because I completely forgot about South Australia last week. I just come back from South Australia.
Most of us do, but go on, sorry.
Look, it's really funny to think that 4 years ago, 4 years and 1 week ago, they had a Liberal government that was gung-ho on 100% renewables by 2030. They lost the election 4 years ago, replaced by the Labor government, which accelerated that target to 2027. That's the end of next year, 100% net renewables. The Liberals backflipped on that target, started hankering about the cost of it and
There are some Liberals left in South Australia. I can think of where
not as far as I can tell, no. And there's only about 4 or 5 seats left. I think they're sort of still jostling with One Nation to be the official opposition, as it were. Although Tom Crichton-Taylor points out there is actually no rule about who the official opposition is. But the Labor is in the overwhelming majority. One Nation has about 4 seats. Liberals have about 5 seats, almost completely obliterated. And Nationals leader, One Nation. He's One Nation now, of course, isn't he? Barnaby Joyce says, well, it's because of the climate thing. People have rejected
He's not a leader,
action.
by the way. He's not the leader.
I know, he's not a leader. Well, anyway, but it just goes to show that you can sort of kid some people all the time. But anyway, I just think it's just really interesting that a moderate party that once understood economics, engineering, and the future of the grid, then turned its back on it, and now pretty much doesn't exist. That's not the only reason why they don't exist anymore, because there was infighting, there was corruption, there was scandal, there's all sorts of funny things going on. But basically a takeover by the right wing of the party, and now it's gone. And
that's at the federal level. I think that's one theme, and I strongly agree with it. And we're getting onto topics that we're not supposed to know anything about, Giles, but like politics. But we do. And the other theme is the one that Dan Cass was talking about, which is just generally the unhappiness with everything that is behind One Nation's rise. The fact that a lot of people, rightly or wrongly, feel that they're not getting the system that they thought they were going to get when they were young. Life has turned out to be a lot harder than they thought it would be. And so they're protesting. I don't want to get into the rights and wrongs of it, but it would be wrong to dismiss, the one thing you have to understand is that every single person's vote is as important as any other person's vote, whether you agree or disagree with it.
Absolutely. And this sort of fossil fuel crisis that we're entering into is only going to reinforce some of those views. And basically, these right wing parties are just sort of hanging on to some sort of series of disasters and catastrophes and unfortunate things, and people will turn to them in some sort of hope that they can somehow solve it, which of course they can't. But you understand some people for thinking that they might. But and that's the problem for the mainstream parties at the moment.
I would have said it was impossible to imagine One Nation in power, and then I look at America.
Well, people said that about Abbott. People said that about Morrison. People said that about
Abbott,
Trump.
Abbott. I was in the same accounting tutor as Tony Abbott for 2 years in a row, as I think I've mentioned before. He's not dumb, right? But One Nation people, by and large, they are dumb. Yeah, but anyway, that's I'm happy to say that, with a few exceptions. But
well, no, I think they're aggrieved.
They're very aggrieved. I don't mean the people who vote for them, their representatives. I mean, Pauline Hanson. Anyway, Giles, it's we can cut all that part about them being dumb out of this conversation as far as I'm concerned. It's not their vote counts just as much.
Well, it's good news to be reminded that you did do accountancy with Tony Abbott. Your paths did diverge, David, and it's good to see that you're still making useful contribution to society. So, thank you very much, David. Look, thank you very much to John Blackburn for making almost an impromptu appearance on the podcast, and it's going to be interesting to see how things play out over the coming weeks. This podcast, of course, has come a bit early this week because of the Easter break, but we will be back next week with another interview and another program, another session of us just sort of ranting about all sorts of things, renewable and otherwise, and we'll have some data on the EVs by then, so that'll be exciting. Have a safe holiday period, everyone. Thanks to our sponsors, Pylon and Everjan. We'll be back with another episode of the podcast next week. Goodbye for now.
Energy Insiders was brought to you by Evergen, the market-leading renewable energy software business that optimises residential and commercial solar and battery systems. Evergen enables large numbers of systems to operate as a single fleet, so network operators can use them as a virtual power plant, generating significant value for consumers, network operators, and the energy system as a whole. Evergen software is powering the energy system of the future. Energy Insiders was also brought to you by Pylon. Pylon provides easy-to-use solar design software for installers and retailers with pay-as-you-go pricing, no monthly cost and no lock-in contracts. Join Australia's top solar companies who trust Pylon to design high-resolution, CEC-ready solar proposals.